Documentation is where learning becomes visible. The documentation of a child's learning process is fundamental to the role of the teacher in a Reggio-Emilia approach. In this approach, educational documentation is a complex process which takes place during the child's learning. Documentation is a prominent feature in both constructivism and the Reggio approach. It includes discussion, debates, the children's project work in the Reggio-Emilia schools and centers. Reggio-Emilia influenced educators are asked to observe, document, and analyze children's learning journeys and to use this process to make informed decisions as to how to guide their future learning. Teachers share and discuss this documentation in order to collaboratively interpret and evaluate each learning process. This, in turn, values the potential of every child and underlines the reciprocal relationships between learning and teaching. As a part of the socio-constructivist process of learning, the centers and preschools of Reggio-Emilia view educational documentation as a public place or forum for observing a culture of childhood and education. According to Rinaldi, in the Reggio approach, documentation is not simply a technique that can be transported, but a way of guaranteeing that our thinking always involves reflection, exchange, different points of view, and differences in assessment or evaluation. The documentation materials we use attest not only to our path of knowledge regarding children, but also to our path of knowledge about the child and humanity, and about ourselves. They also attest to our ideas of the teacher as researcher, of school as a place of research and cultural elaboration, a place of participation in a process of shared construction of values and meanings. Therefore, documentation generates discussion, debate, dialogue, and reciprocal learning. Group learning and a focus on collective meaning making requires that ideas be compared, analyzed, discussed, and modified, a process that creates a quality of learning not accessible to the individual. Documentation serves the dual role of making children's learning visible and providing a platform from which to integrate and reflect on teaching practices. Collaboratively studying documentation also facilitates the development of critical thinking and dialogue skills, which in turn improves practice. In constructivist theory, assessment includes student works, observations, and points of view as well as tests. Process is as important as product, but there is no formal assessment in the Reggio-Emilia schools. Through students' projects and documentation, teachers and parents understand students' learning processes. To conclude, in the recent update of the principles guiding a Reggio-Emilia approach, there is an added emphasis on assessment of the educational project. The assessment is focused on the structured process of all learning, including the child's learning, the professionalism of the educators, and the organization and quality of the service provided. The assessment process is seen as an opportunity to recognize and negotiate the meanings and intentions of the educational process. The pedagogical coordinating team, the work group, and the educators in the schools use practices that support the documentation and encourage the participation of the families and community in the process. Now we want to follow up with a few questions for reflection. What is not documentation in a Reggio environment? Is it A, videos, B, anecdotal notes, C, pictures, or D, children's work samples? Well, as you probably guessed, this was a trick question. All of the answers are actually documentation you will see in a Reggio environment. The last question is stated, documentation serves which dual roles? Choose two of the following answers. A, making children's learning visible. B, making children's learning promotable. C, integrate and reflect on teaching practices. Or D, evaluate colleagues' misinterpretations. The correct answers are making children's learning visible and integrate and reflect on teaching practices.